a struggling rancher found a deaf girl tied to his fence, with "Unwanted" written in charcoal across her dress. Out on the frozen prairie, he thought he was just fighting to keep his cattle alive. But now, he's staring at a child. No. One claims, a child who cannot speak, yet sees and understands more than anyone around her. The townsfolk whisper, she's cursed. The banker says she'll ruin him. And the army rides in with orders to take her away. But this girl carries a hidden truth, a truth that could save the rancher's salor, tear his world apart. In a land where law and justice don't always walk the same road, how far will one broken man go to protect the child everyone else called unwanted? Before we begin, share a piece of your world in the comments, your city, your energy. It's a powerful thing, being part of something bigger than ourselves. The harsh Colorado wind bit through Ethan. Hale's worn canvas coat as he guided his horse along the fence line in the pre-dawn darkness. Sleep had been scarce lately, his mind, too, full of worries about unpaid bills and the bank's threats to foreclose on his struggling ranch. The creaking leather of his saddle and the soft thud of his horse's hooves against frozen ground kept time with his troubled thoughts. Frost sparkled on the brown grass as the first rays of sunlight crept over the eastern hills. Ethan's eyes swept the fence posts automatically, checking for broken wires or damaged sections that might let his precious few cattle stray. These daily rides had become a ritual of survival since Sarah's passing 3 years ago, leaving him to manage the ranch alone. The sun had barely cleared the horizon when something unusual caught his eye, a dark bundle tied to the fence about 50 yards ahead. Ethan nudged his horse forward, squinting against the golden morning light. As he drew closer, his heart nearly stopped. It wasn't a bundle at all, but a small figure bound to the fence posts with rough rope. "Dear Lord in heaven," he whispered, jumping down from his horse. His boots crunched on the frozen grass as he rushed forward. It was a young girl, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, wearing a thin cotton dress despite the bitter cold. Her dark hair hung in tangles around her face, and her hands were bound too. The fence wire with cruel efficiency. Across the front of her dress, someone had written "Unwanted" in crude black charcoal letters. The child's eyes flew open as his shadow fell across her wide, intelligent eyes that held neither tears nor fear, only a penetrating awareness that made Ethan's chest ache. Her lips were blue with cold, but she didn't make a sound. "It's all right now," Ethan said softly, pulling out his pocket knife to cut the ropes. "I won't hurt you." The girl didn't respond or flinch as he worked the blade carefully between her wrists and the bindings. Her gaze remained fixed on his face with an intensity that made him wonder if she could see straight into his soul. "Can you tell me your name?" he asked when her hands were free. She didn't answer or give any sign she'd heard him. Ethan touched her shoulder gently to get her attention. An understanding dawned as she watched his lips move without reaction. The child was deaf. Who would do such a thing? He muttered, though he knew she couldn't hear his words. Rage burned in his belly at the cruelty of leaving a deaf child tied to a fence in the cold night. Like unwanted cattle turned loose on the range, the girl's legs trembled as Ethan helped her stand, her feet numb from cold and cramped positions. Without hesitation, he lifted her onto his horse, then mounted behind her. She sat straight and still in the saddle, neither leaning into him for warmth nor pulling away in fear. The ride back to his ranch house seemed longer than usual. Oh, it was barely a mile. The morning sun did little to warm the air, and Ethan could feel the child shivering against him despite her rigid posture. He urged his horse to a faster pace. The small ranch house came into view, weathered boards silvered by sun and wind. Smoke curling from the stone chimney where the breakfast fire still smoldered. It wasn't much, but it was shelter and warmth. Ethan lifted the girl down and led her inside, where the air still held some heat from the morning's fire. He wrapped his warmest blanket around her shoulders, the wool one Sarah had brought from back east when they'd married. The girl's fingers clutched the edges of the blanket, but her face remained composed, watching his every move in the kitchen. Ethan cut thick slices of yesterday's cornbread and poured fresh milk into a tin cup. The girl accepted both without expression, but ate quickly once he motioned that the food was for her. She held the cup with both hands, sipping the milk slowly as if savoring every drop. As morning stretched toward noon, Ethan tried to make sense of his situation. The girl needed medical attention, proper clothes, and someone who knew how to communicate with her. But the nearest town was 20 miles away, and he had no way to ask her name or where she'd come from. The crude message on her dress suggested a story he wasn't sure he wanted to know. That evening, as shadows lengthened across the plank floor, Ethan lit the lamp on the kitchen table. The girl had spent the day perched quietly in Sarah's old rocking chair, watching him with those solemn eyes as he did his chores. Now she sat across from him at the table, the lamplight flickering across her face as she folded and unfolded a corner of the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. Ethan bowed his head, closing his eyes in prayer as he'd done every night since Sarah died, though lately the words had felt hollow and distant. Tonight was different. Tonight he had a child at his table, a deaf girl abandoned by someone who'd marked her as unwanted, delivered to his fence like a sign he couldn't ignore. "Lord," he whispered, "I don't know if I can handle one more burden. This ranch is failing, and I can barely feed myself some months." He opened his eyes to find the girl studying him intently. "But I reckon you put her in my path for a reason. Please give me the wisdom to know what's right and the strength to do it." The lamp flame wavered, casting dancing shadows on the wall. Outside, a coyote called lonely into the gathering dark. Ethan felt the weight of responsibility settle deeper onto his shoulders, even as his heart stirred with something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of purpose. Beyond mere survival, dawn painted the eastern sky in pale gold as Ethan saddled his horse. The girl watched from the porch, still wrapped in Sarah's blanket, her dark eyes following his every movement. He'd managed to find one of Sarah's old shawls in a trunk, and though it hung loose on the child's thin frame, at least it covered the cruel message on her dress. "We need to ride into town," he said, though he knew she couldn't hear him. The words were more to steady himself than anything else. Speaking them aloud made his plan feel more certain. The girl understood his gesturing and came forward without hesitation. Ethan lifted her onto the horse, settling her in front of him in the saddle. She sat straight-backed and alert, her small hands gripping his coat as they set off down the rutted road toward Silver Creek. The 20-mile ride stretched before them, marked by fence posts and scattered clusters of cattle grazing in the morning mist. The girl didn't fidget or complain as many children might. She remained perfectly still, though Ethan could feel her tension in the way she held herself. The sun had climbed high by the time the first buildings of Silver Creek came into view. Ethan guided his horse down the main street, past the telegraph office and the bank, whose notices had been keeping him awake at night. He drew up in front of Jensen's Mercantile, where several wagons were already tied to the hitching post. As he lifted the girl down from the saddle, people began to gather. Mrs. Jensen stepped out onto the store's wooden porch, wiping her hands on her apron. Old Man Tucker paused in his whittling, pipe forgotten in his mouth. Within minutes, a small crowd had formed, drawn by the unusual sight of stern Ethan Hale arriving in town with a mysterious child. "Found her tied to my fence yesterday morning," Ethan explained, keeping one protective hand on the girl's shoulder. "Someone wrote 'Unwanted' across her dress. She's deaf, can't tell me where she came from." Instead of the sympathy he'd expected, faces hardened. Whispers rippled through the crowd. "Looks like one of them half-breeds from up north," Tucker muttered around his pipe stem. Mrs. Jensen crossed herself. Deaf, you say? Must be cursed. My cousin had a cursed child once. What use is a deaf girl? Someone else called out. Can't even hear danger coming. Heat crept up Ethan's neck. But it wasn't shame for the girl, it was shame for his neighbors, for their quick judgment and cruel words. The child stood quietly beside him, but he could feel her trembling slightly under his hand. Suddenly, a commotion erupted near the livery stable. One of Whitaker's new horses, a half-broke stallion, had pulled free from its tie. The animal bolted down the street, eyes rolling white with panic. 8-year-old Tommy Peters stood frozen in its path, a candy stick dropped forgotten at his feet. Before Ethan could move, the girl burst from beneath his hand. She darted forward, arms raised, her shawl falling away as she planted herself between Tommy and the charging horse. Her movements were precise and fearless. She waved her arms in sharp, deliberate motions that caught the stallion's attention. The horse, startled by this small figure, suddenly in its path, shied sideways with a snort. Its hooves clattered on the packed dirt as it veered away from Tommy, who stood unharmed but shaking. A collective gasp went up from the crowd. Tommy's mother rushed forward to clutch her son, tears streaming down her face. The horse, its panic spent, allowed itself to be caught by the livery boy who came running up with a lead rope. Well, Old Man Tucker's pipe had fallen from his slack mouth. The girl returned to Ethan's side as calmly as she'd left it, though her chest rose and fell quickly with exertion. She picked up Sarah's shawl from where it had fallen and wrapped it around herself again with dignity. That was quick thinking, came a gentle voice. Miss Clara Dawson, the schoolteacher, stepped forward from the crowd. Her brown eyes were warm with interest as she studied the girl. She's quite alert and aware of her surroundings, isn't she? Ethan nodded, relief flooding through him at finding at least one friendly face. Yes, ma'am. Seems to notice everything. Clara knelt down to the girl's eye level, moving slowly so as not to startle her. The child met her gaze steadily. Hello, Clara said, making sure the girl could see her lips clearly. She accompanied the word with a simple gesture, touching her fingers to her lips and moving them outward. To everyone's surprise, the girl's face brightened with recognition. She repeated the gesture perfectly. She knows some sign language, Clara said, standing up. Mr. Hale, I think the best course would be for you to keep her at your ranch while we try to find out where she came from. I could come out occasionally. Help teach her more signs. She glanced at the now subdued crowd. She clearly has much to offer, if people would only look past their prejudices. Ethan hesitated. The thought of adding another responsibility to his struggling ranch made his stomach knot with worry. But when he looked down at the girl, standing straight and proud despite everything, something shifted in his heart. Reckon that might be best, he said finally, at least for now. The ride home seemed shorter than the morning journey. The girl sat more relaxed in the saddle, and Ethan found himself pointing out landmarks along the way, even though she couldn't hear his words. The afternoon sun warmed their backs as they approached the ranch house. As Ethan unsaddled his horse, the girl slipped away toward the chicken coop. He watched, curious, as she gathered her shawl in one hand and began collecting eggs with the other, moving with the careful confidence of someone who'd done this task many times before. She placed each egg gently in her makeshift basket, as if she'd always belonged here, as if she knew exactly what needed doing. Ethan felt something ease in his chest, a tension he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. Maybe Clara was right. Maybe this strange, brave child had more to offer than anyone suspected. He watched as she emerged from the coop with her gathered eggs, her face composed but somehow lighter than it had been that morning. Dawn painted the eastern sky in pale gold as Ethan stepped onto his front porch. The morning air held a crisp bite, and frost glittered on the fence posts. Behind him, the girl stood quietly, wrapped in one of Sarah's old shawls. her dark eyes taking in everything. "Time to start the day's work," Ethan said, more out of habit than necessity. He gestured for her to follow, and she fell into step beside him without hesitation. Their first stop was the barn, where Ethan showed her how to measure out feed for the horses. Though she couldn't hear his instructions, she watched his every move with intense focus, noting how he filled the scoop just to the rim. When he handed her the scoop, she copied his movements exactly, getting the measure perfect on her first try. Out in the pasture, cattle lifted their heads as Ethan approached with hay. The girl stayed close, observing how he scattered it in long lines so every animal could reach. A young calf, born weak and early, struggled to push through the herd to feed. Without prompting, the girl slipped forward, gently guiding the stronger cattle aside. She knelt beside the calf, steadying it with careful hands until it could reach the hay. Ethan paused, struck by the tenderness in her actions. The word came to him then, clear as sunrise: hope. That's what he saw in her patient care of the calf. Hope, gentle but persistent. The name felt right, like it had been waiting for her. Later, while Ethan hammered loose boards back onto the north fence, Hope handed him nails, one by one. She'd notice when his hammer struck awkwardly, and without being told, she'd adjust how. She held the boards steady. By midday, they'd repaired 3 fence sections together, working in a rhythm that needed no words. At the well, Ethan demonstrated how to work the pump handle. Hope's first attempt splashed water everywhere, but she didn't give up. Soon she was drawing water smoothly, filling the bucket without spilling a drop. She carried it carefully to the house, pride showing in her straight shoulders. The afternoon sun was sinking when they finally headed inside. Ethan stirred up the cook-stove fire and set about making supper, a simple meal of beans he'd soaked that morning and biscuits from the last of his flour. Hope watched from nearby, her eyes following his movements as he worked. When they sat down to eat, Ethan noticed how she waited until he'd taken his first bite before starting her own. Manners spoke of someone's teaching somewhere in her past. After the meal, she rose and began gathering the plates without being asked. She stacked them carefully, then picked up Sarah's old checkered tablecloth. With gentle hands, she shook it out and folded it into neat squares, just as Sarah used to do. Ethan's throat tightened. The simple action brought back memories of evenings spent watching his wife tend to their home. But now, seeing Hope's careful movements, the memories held less pain. The house, which had felt so empty since Sarah's passing, seemed to breathe again with new life. "I need to ride into town," Ethan told Hope through gestures. He pointed to himself, then mimicked riding, then pointed towards Silver Creek. Hope nodded, understanding. Mrs. Barnes, their nearest neighbor, agreed to watch Hope for a few hours, though the girl seemed uncertain about being left with a stranger. She gave Ethan a brave nod as he mounted his horse. The saloon was busy when Ethan arrived in town. He ordered coffee and settled at a corner table, listening as he asked casual questions about any missing children or traveling families. Most folks just shrugged, but then he caught fragments of conversation from a group of ranch hands near the bar. That Apache brat someone dumped on Hale's land. Probably from them settlements up north. Unwanted for good reason, I reckon. Ethan's coffee turned bitter in his mouth. He'd suspected Hope might be Apache, but hearing it spoken with such spite made his stomach turn. He left the saloon quickly, troubled by the undercurrent of hostility in those whispered words. The sun had set by the time he collected Hope. From Mrs. Barnes, the woman had nothing but praise for the girl's behavior, though she did mention that Hope had spent much of the afternoon drawing pictures in the dirt with a stick. Back home, Hope disappeared into the kitchen while Ethan lit the lamp. When she returned, she was clutching an old slate she must have found in one of the cupboards. She sat at the table and began scratching shapes onto its surface with a piece of chalk, circles, lines, and patterns that seemed to have meaning to her. Ethan pulled his chair closer, watching as she worked. Hope's face showed intense concentration, her small fingers moving deliberately across the slate. When she finished a series of marks, she looked up at him expectantly, clearly trying to share something of herself. "That's real fine drawing, Hope," he said softly, pointing to the slate and nodding. Her face brightened at his approval, and she quickly began another pattern. Watching her eager attempts to communicate, Ethan felt the last of his uncertainty about her presence melt away. This child, unwanted by others, yet so determined to connect, had already begun to change his home from a place of mourning into something new. He reached out and gently touched her shoulder, causing her to look up. "Welcome home, Hope," he said clearly, accompanying the words with a smile and a gesture that encompassed the room. Though she couldn't hear the words, she seemed to understand their meaning. Her answering smile transformed her whole face, chasing away the shadows of fear he'd first seen in her eyes at the fence. A week had passed since Hope's arrival, and Sunday morning dawned clear and cool. Ethan helped her smooth down her freshly washed dress, one of Miss Dawson's old ones, altered to fit, and combed her dark hair neat and tidy. Hope stood still as a statue while he worked, only her eyes moving as she watched their reflection in the small mirror. "Church today," he said, though she couldn't hear. He made a steeple shape with his hands, and she nodded, understanding. They'd practiced this gesture the day before. The ride into town was quiet, with Hope perched in front of him on the saddle. As they approached the white-painted church, Ethan felt her spine stiffen. Several townsfolk had already gathered outside, and their stares followed horse and riders all the way to the hitching post. Inside, Ethan guided Hope to a pew near the back. She slid in first, then he took the aisle seat, noting how some folks shifted away while others craned their necks to watch. Mrs. Peterson, 3 rows ahead, whispered something behind her hand to her husband, who frowned and shook his head. But Hope paid no mind to the attention. Her eyes were fixed on Reverend Mills as he stepped to the pulpit. Throughout the service, she studied the faces around her with intense focus, the way lips moved in prayer, how hands lifted in praise, the rhythm of bodies swaying to hymns she couldn't hear. Her own small hands sometimes moved slightly, as if feeling the vibrations of the organ through the wooden pew. After the final amen, Miss Clara Dawson made her way to their pew, her blue dress rustling softly. Hope's face brightened at the sight of her. "Good morning, Mr. Hale," Clara said warmly. "And good morning to you, Hope." She accompanied her greeting with a gentle wave and a smile. Miss Dawson, Ethan nodded, his hat in his hands. "Kind of you to stop by." "I've been studying something that might help," Clara said. She turned to Hope and slowly raised her right hand to her forehead, then brought it down in a salute-like motion. "That means hello in sign language. Would you like to try?" Hope's eyes widened with interest. She carefully copied the movement, her small hand following the same path. "Very good." Clara's praise needed no translation. Her smile said it all. She showed them a few more simple signs. "Thank you," "please," and "yes." Hope absorbed each one eagerly, while Ethan practiced alongside her, his larger hands moving with less grace but equal determination. Their lesson was interrupted by harsh whispers from a group of men near the door. "Indian blood shows true," one muttered. "Mark my words, trouble follows their kind." Ethan's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Mr. Horace Griggs stepped forward. The banker's suit was immaculate as always, his watch chain glinting in the morning light. Mr. Hale, Griggs said smoothly, "Might I have a word?" He gestured toward the church steps. Outside, Griggs lit a cigar, studying Ethan through the smoke. Folks are talking, Hale. This situation with the girl. It's drawing attention you can't afford right now. Hope's done nothing wrong, Ethan said firmly. Perhaps not yet. Griggs tapped ash from his cigar. But strays like her, they bring complications. Speaking of which, that loan payment's coming due soon. Might be wise to consider selling before things get difficult. The ranch isn't for sale. Ethan's voice was quiet but hard as iron. And hope stays with me. Griggs shrugged, his smile never reaching his eyes. Your choice, of course, for now. He turned away, leaving the threat hanging in the air like his cigar smoke. The sky had darkened while they talked, heavy clouds rolling in from the west. As Ethan returned to the church, he found Hope and Clara helping organize the children's Sunday lesson in the attached schoolhouse. Thunder rumbled in the distance, making the windows rattle. Hope's head snapped up at the vibration. She hurried to the window, pressing her palm against the glass. Her expression grew concerned, and she began making urgent gestures to Clara. What is it? Clara asked, though Hope couldn't hear. But the girl was already moving, gently but firmly gathering the smaller children together. Another thunderclap boomed, closer now, and several children jumped. The storm cellar, Clara realized, watching Hope guide the little ones toward the trapdoor. She must have felt it coming before any of us noticed. Rain began hammering the roof as Hope helped the last child down the cellar steps. Below, some of the children were crying, frightened by the storm's fury. But Hope moved among them with calm assurance, showing them how to feel the vibrations through the earth, turning their fear into curiosity. She demonstrated how to count between lightning and thunder by watching Clara's lips form numbers. Making a game of it, Ethan stood at the top of the stairs, watching in amazement. This girl, who others called cursed, was teaching these children a different way of experiencing the world. By the time the storm passed, the cellar rang with silent laughter as Hope played hand-clapping games with her new friends, as parents came to collect their children. More than one stopped to thank Hope, their earlier suspicion replaced by genuine gratitude. Even Mrs. Peterson, who had whispered during church, gave the girl a warm pat on the shoulder. The sun was setting when Ethan and Hope prepared to ride home. Clara walked them to their horse, her shawl pulled tight against the evening chill. "You've got a remarkable girl there, Mr. Hale," she said softly. "That I do, Miss Dawson." Their eyes met briefly, sharing something deeper than words could express. "Thank you for your help today. With the signs, I mean. It's my pleasure." Clara reached up to touch Hope's hand. "You come see me at school sometime, dear. We'll learn more together." Hope nodded eagerly. Then, with careful concentration, she formed her fingers into the shape Clara had taught them for family. The gesture was clumsy, but its meaning shone in her eyes. Dawn painted the Colorado sky in gentle strokes of pink and gold as Ethan stepped onto his front porch, coffee cup warming his hands. Hope was already in the barn, having risen early to help with chores. Her small figure moved purposefully between the stalls, distributing hay to hungry horses. The peaceful morning shattered at the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Ethan's hand instinctively moved to his hip, though he hadn't worn a gun since his wife passed. A lone rider appeared through the morning haze, dust coating his blue uniform and brass buttons. The army man sat straight-backed on his mount, every inch the career soldier. Ethan set his cup down on the porch rail. "Can I help you?" The rider dismounted with practiced efficiency, his spurs jingling against packed earth. "Sergeant Thomas Miller, United States Army." He removed his kepi cap, revealing close-cropped hair gone gray at the temples. "I'm here about the Apache girl." Ethan's stomach tightened. "Her name is Hope." According to our records, Miller continued, as if Ethan hadn't spoken. "She's the daughter of Walking Wolf, one of our scouts." Good man. Killed in the line of duty 6 months ago near Fort Bowie. A movement caught Ethan's eye. Hope stood in the barn doorway, watching them intently. Though she couldn't hear their words, something in their stance must have alarmed her. The girl was left with settler families. Miller went on, his tone matter-of-fact. Reports indicate she was poorly treated. Ran away twice. Last family. Claimed she was possessed by evil spirits because of her condition. He shook his head. Superstitious nonsense. But there it is. Asterisk, she's not possessed, Ethan said firmly. She's deaf, that's all. Smart as any child I've ever met. Nevertheless, there are regulations to follow. Miller pulled a folded paper from his breast pocket. By federal law, she belongs on the San Carlos Reservation. There's an orphanage. There for cases like hers. Hope must have sensed the tension. She crept closer, her bare feet silent on the packed earth, until she reached Ethan's side. Her small hand slipped into his, gripping tight. She's doing well here, Ethan protested. Learning every day. The schoolteacher's been showing us both. Hand signs. She helps with chores, tends the animals better than most ranch hands I've had. Miller's expression softened slightly. I don't doubt it, Mr. Hale, but good intentions don't change the law. The Army's responsible for all Chiricahua Apache, especially children. Responsible? Ethan's voice rose. Like those settlers were responsible? Hope pressed closer to his leg, trembling slightly. Ethan forced himself to calm down, squeezing her hand gently. I'll return within the week with proper documentation, Miller said, replacing his cap. Best prepare yourself and her for the transfer. He turned toward his horse, then paused. For what it's worth, I'm sorry, but orders are orders. They watched the sergeant ride away, his straight back never wavering until dust swallowed his figure. Only then did Ethan realize how tightly Hope was clinging to him, her face buried against his side. The day passed in a fog of worry. Hope followed Ethan closer than usual, as if afraid he might disappear. When he checked fence lines, she rode double with him. While he repaired a broken wagon wheel, she sat nearby, whittling a small piece of wood with focused determination. Even at supper, she kept glancing at him, her dark eyes full of questions he couldn't answer. Evening brought no peace. Ethan sat at his kitchen table, Bible open before him, but the words blurred together. The lamp cast Hope's shadow on the wall. As she wandered restlessly around the room, touching familiar objects, the clock on the mantel, his wife's china teacup, the worn quilt draped over the rocking chair. Finally, bedtime arrived. Hope climbed into the small bed Ethan had set up in the spare room once meant for children of his own. He tucked the patchwork quilt around her shoulders, just as he had every night since finding her. But tonight was different. Hope sat up suddenly. Reaching toward the wooden headboard, her finger traced a shape, there, up, down, across. A cross, just like the one she'd studied so intently in church. Ethan's throat tightened. Without words, without hearing a single sermon, Hope had grasped something essential about faith. She looked at him, then made the sign again, followed by the gesture for family that Miss Dawson had taught them. Yes, Ethan whispered, though she couldn't hear. We're family, and I won't let them take you. The words felt like a prayer, a promise and a rebellion all at once. Hope settled back against her pillow, seeming comforted by his presence. Ethan stayed until her breathing deepened into sleep, watching the moonlight paint silver patterns across her peaceful face. Later, alone in the quiet house, Ethan paced his bedroom floor. The weight of decision pressed down on him like a physical thing. The law stood on one side, his conscience on the other. He thought of his own struggles, the mounting debt, the whispers in town. Taking on a child, especially one the Army wanted, would only make everything harder. But then he remembered Hope's fingers tracing that cross. Her silent trust, her eager mind learning new ways to speak. He thought of other children who'd found their way to new families on the frontier. Surely God had led her to his fence that frosty morning for a reason. Ethan knelt beside his bed, clasping his hands together. The same prayer he'd whispered that first night came back to him. Lord, give me wisdom. But now he added something more. And give me strength to do what's right. Outside, a coyote called to its mate across the dark prairie. The sound drifted through Hope's open window, but she slept on, untroubled by the night's wild music. In her dreams, perhaps, she was already home. Morning sunlight streamed through the kitchen window as Ethan demonstrated another hand sign to Hope. His fingers moved slowly, deliberately forming the shape Miss Dawson had taught him. Water, he said aloud, though Hope couldn't hear. He pointed to the tin cup on the table, then repeated the gesture. Hope's face scrunched in concentration. Her small hands copied his movement, clumsy at first, then with growing confidence. When she got it right, her whole face lit up with pride. Good. Ethan signed, using another gesture they'd learned. The smile that spread across Hope's face warmed something deep in his chest. They spent breakfast practicing more signs hoarse. Bread, thank you. Each successful word bridged the silence between them. When Hope correctly signed home while pointing to the ranch house, Ethan had to look away to hide the moisture in his eyes. After breakfast, they headed out to check the fence lines. Hope rode behind him on the horse, her arms wrapped securely around his waist. The morning air carried the scent of sage and prairie grass. They stopped to repair a loose post, working together in comfortable silence. Hope held the nails while Ethan hammered, her movements sure and steady. At midday, they rode into town for supplies. The mercantile's bell jingled as they entered, but the usual friendly greetings were missing. Customers whispered behind raised hands, their eyes following Hope as she studied the candy jars on the counter. Horace Griggs stood near the coffee barrel, holding court with several ranchers. His voice carried deliberately across the store. Mighty peculiar, don't you think? Hale, taking in that savage child, could bring trouble down on all of us. Ethan's jaw tightened as he collected flour and coffee beans. Hope sensed his tension, staying close to his side. I heard she's cursed, someone muttered. That's why she can't hear. Mark my words, Griggs continued. Harboring Indian strays will bring ruin to that ranch. Bad enough, he's behind on his payments. That's quite enough, Mr. Griggs. Miss Clara Dawson stood in the doorway, her normally gentle face stern with disapproval. I won't stand by while you spread cruel gossip about an innocent child. Now, Miss Dawson, Griggs said smoothly. We're just concerned about the community's welfare. Surely you understand, I understand, that Hope is a bright, capable girl who's found a good home with Mr. Hale. Clara's voice was firm. Anyone who's actually spent time with her knows that. Hope tugged at Ethan's sleeve, pointing outside. Dark clouds had gathered suddenly, turning the afternoon sky an ominous green. But something else caught his attention. Hope was gesturing urgently toward the pasture where his cattle grazed. What is it? He signed. Hope made the sign for storm that Clara had taught them, then mimicked cattle running. Her eyes were wide with concern. Ethan didn't hesitate. They rushed to their horse, leaving their purchases behind. As they rode toward the pasture, the wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain. Hope's small body trembled against his back, but her finger pointed steadily toward the herd. They found the cattle already restless, sensing the approaching storm. Without prompting, Hope slid from the horse and began moving along the edges of the herd, her presence somehow calming the nervous animals. Together, they guided the cattle toward a sheltered draw just as the first heavy drops fell. The storm hit hard and fast. Huddled under Ethan's coat, Hope helped him count the calves, making sure none had strayed. Her strange sensitivity to the animals' behavior had warned them just in time. Without her warning, they might have lost several too. Exposure? Hours later, they sat before the fireplace, their clothes still damp from the rain. Hope had wrapped herself in a quilt, contentedly sketching on her slate. Ethan knelt beside his chair, hands clasped in prayer, as was his evening custom. "Lord," he whispered, "thank you for sending her to me. I reckon I needed her as much as she needed me." He didn't notice Hope watching him, her dark eyes soft with trust and understanding. "I know now why you led her to my fence that morning." His voice grew stronger. "She's not just some responsibility you laid on me. He paused, emotion making his throat tight. "She's my daughter, Lord. Maybe not by blood, but by something deeper." Hope set aside her slate and moved to kneel beside him. Though she couldn't hear his words, she folded her hands like his, her shoulder touching his arm. Together, they stayed that way for a long moment, while the fire crackled and rain drummed on the roof. Later, after tucking Hope into bed, Ethan sat at his kitchen table, staring at the Army sergeant's warning letter. His decision crystallized, hard and clear as the courts in the hills. They could come with their papers and their laws, but he wouldn't let them take her. Hope wasn't just some unwanted child anymore. She was his daughter, and this was her home. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving the night air clean and cool. Stars peeked through breaking clouds, their light falling on the silent ranch house where a family had been forged in trust and love. Beyond the need for words, Sunday morning dawned clear and bright over the Colorado hills. Ethan straightened his best string tie while Hope smoothed her freshly pressed dress. The same one she'd worn when he found her now, cleaned and mended by Miss Dawson's careful hands. The cruel charcoal message was long gone, replaced by a neat row of tiny flowers Clara had embroidered along the hem. "Ready?" Ethan signed, using the gestures they'd been practicing. Hope nodded, her dark eyes bright with anticipation. She'd been studying her slate all week, drawing pictures of the church and its cross-top steeple. They rode into town together, Hope sitting tall in front of him on the saddle. The morning air carried the sweetness of late summer and the church. Bell rang out across the valley. As they approached, Ethan felt Hope's small body tense at the sight of townspeople gathering on the church steps. "It's all right," he murmured, though she couldn't hear. He squeezed her shoulder gently. Inside the whitewashed church, they found their usual pew near the back. Some folks still turned to stare, but Hope held her head high, watching everything with keen interest. She studied Reverend Blackwood's lips as he delivered his sermon, her fingers sometimes moving slightly as if trying to catch the shape of his words. The morning light streamed through simple glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across the wooden floor. When the congregation stood to sing hymns, Hope placed her hand on the pew in front of her, feeling the vibrations of many voices raised in praise. After the service, Miss Dawson approached them with a warm smile. "Mr. Hale, Hope, would you join me for Sunday supper? I've prepared more than enough for 3. Hope's face lit up at the sight of the schoolteacher. Clara had been teaching them both more hand signs, opening new ways for Hope to express herself. "That's mighty kind of you," Ethan replied, touched by the invitation. He noticed how Hope was already signing thank you to Clara. Clara's home was a tidy cottage near the schoolhouse, filled with books and the aroma of roasted chicken. Several children from her class had joined them, curious about Hope's special way of talking. Soon the room was full of giggling as Hope taught them simple signs. "Look, Ma," young Tommy Wilson called to his mother. Hope showed me how to say horse. His clumsy fingers formed the sign, while Hope nodded ENCOURAGINGLY. Ethan watched from his chair. something tight in his chest, loosening at the sight of Hope surrounded by accepting faces. Clara caught his eye and smiled, her expression soft with understanding. "She's flourishing with you," she said quietly. "Anyone can see it." Before Ethan could respond, Reverend Blackwood's tall frame filled the doorway. The preacher's weathered face was thoughtful as he observed the scene before him. "Brother Hale," he said, gesturing Ethan aside. "Might I have a word?" They stepped onto Clara's small porch, where the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the weathered boards. "I've been watching that child," Reverend Blackwood began, his deep voice earnest. "Seeing how she's changed since you found her. Perhaps the Lord has given you this charge for a purpose." Ethan's heart quickened. "That's what I've been thinking, Reverend. She needs a real home, a family. I aim to give her that." "The Army may have other ideas," Blackwood warned. "That's why I need your help." Ethan squared his shoulders. "Would you witness an informal adoption? Something that shows Christian folks stood behind it?" The preacher stroked his graying beard. "Considering it wouldn't hold up in federal court, mind you, but as a statement of moral duty and community support." He nodded slowly. "Yes, I'll draft something. Get some respectable townspeople to sign as witnesses." Through the window, they could see Hope showing Clara a new sign she'd invented for beautiful. The schoolteacher's laugh carried through the glass. "Thank you, Reverend," Ethan said hoarsely. "This means more than I can say." Later that evening, back at the ranch, the house glowed with lamplight and newfound purpose. Hope sat at the kitchen table, carefully practicing her signs while Ethan washed the supper dishes. "Here," he said, drying his hands and pulling his chair closer to hers. "Let me show you something special." Slowly, he formed the sign for family that Clara had taught him. Hope watched intently, then copied the gesture. Her small fingers moved with growing confidence as she repeated it. "Family," she signed again and again, her smile radiant. Then she pointed to herself and to Ethan, making the sign once more. "That's right," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "We're family now." The evening settled softly around them, as Hope curled up in her favorite blanket by the fire. She clutched the wooden horse Ethan had carved for her, her fingers tracing its smooth lines as her eyes grew heavy. The firelight caught the gentle rise and fall of her chest as she drifted off to sleep. Ethan sat in his chair, watching over her. The house felt different, now warmer, fuller. Hope's quiet presence had brought laughter back to these rooms that had known too much sorrow. Her slate with its careful drawings lay on the table next to his Bible and the beginning of Reverend Blackwood's adoption statement. Looking at her peaceful face in the lamplight, Ethan made a silent vow. No one would ever abandon her again. No one would ever make her feel unwanted. Here, in this house that had seemed too empty for so long, she had found her home. And he had found healing in the simple gift of loving a child who needed him, too. Days passed like a sweet dream at the Hale Ranch. The morning sun found Ethan leading a gentle pony around the corral. Hope perched carefully in the saddle. Her face glowed with determination as she gripped the reins just as he had shown her. "That's it," he encouraged, though she could not hear. Her eyes stayed fixed on his hands as he demonstrated the signs for hold and steady. The pony, a dappled mare named Penny, seemed to sense Hope's special nature. She stepped with careful precision, responding to the lightest touch. Hope's smile grew wider with each circle of the corral. Later that same morning, they stood side by side at the kitchen table, flour dusting their clothes. Hope's small hands mimicked Ethan's movements as he showed her how to knead bread dough. She delighted in the way it squished between her fingers, leaving tiny handprints in the soft surface. The kitchen filled with warmth from the wood stove and the sweet smell of baking bread. Ethan watched Hope's face light up as she pulled her first loaf from the oven, golden brown and perfect. These simple moments felt like healing to his long empty home. but their peace shattered when hoofbeats thundered into the yard. Sergeant Miller sat straight-backed on his army mount, his blue uniform stark against the autumn sky. Two other soldiers flanked him, their faces impassive. Hope pressed against Ethan's leg, her fingers clutching his trouser fabric. "Mr. Hale," Miller said, dismounting with a sheaf of papers in his hand, "I trust you know why I'm here." Ethan's throat tightened. "Sergeant, please. She belongs here now. Anyone can see she's thriving. Your irregular adoption holds no legal weight." Miller's voice was flat as he held out the documents. "These are federal orders. The girl must be relocated to the designated reservation orphanage." "You can't," Ethan began, but commotion from the road cut him short. A wagon approached, carrying Horace Griggs and several townsmen. They spilled out, faces hard with purpose. Griggs stepped forward, his banker's coat pristine despite the dusty road. "Now see here, Hale," Griggs called out. "You're putting this whole community at risk, defying Army orders. What if her people come looking? What if that's enough?" Clara Dawson's voice rang out as she rode up on her mare, Reverend Blackwood close behind. "Hope is a child of God, not a threat to anyone." The Reverend dismounted, his tall frame commanding. "Attention. Brothers and sisters, consider your Christian duty. This child was abandoned to our mercy. The law is clear," Sergeant Miller cut in. "Federal jurisdiction supersedes local sentiment." He nodded to his men, who moved forward purposefully. Hope began trembling, her dark eyes wide with fear. She wrapped her arms around Ethan's waist, pressing her face into his shirt. He could feel her silent sobs shaking her small frame. "Please," Ethan's voice cracked. "She's my daughter now, in every way that matters." "Step aside," Mr. Hale Miller ordered. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Clara rushed forward, tears streaming. "At least let me pack some things for her. Her slate, her warm shawl." "Now, Sergeant," Griggs pressed, his voice oily with false concern. "Best get this done quickly." The soldiers moved in. One took Hope's arms while another pulled her away from Ethan's desperate grip. She fought silently, her face contorted in a soundless scream that tore at Ethan's heart. "Hope!" he called uselessly, knowing she could not hear. His hands formed the sign for love over and over, even as the soldiers lifted her onto a horse. Reverend Blackwood placed a restraining hand on Ethan's shoulder as he lunged forward. "Don't make them arrest you, son. You can't help her from a jail cell." Hope's tear-streaked face turned back to him as the soldiers rode away, her small hands signing family until she disappeared around the bend. The gathered crowd dispersed, some looking ashamed, others satisfied. Griggs lingered, watching Ethan with calculating eyes. "Might be time to reconsider my offer on your ranch, Hale," he said smoothly. "Now that you're alone again." Ethan's hands clenched into fists, but Clara stepped between them. "Leave," she ordered Griggs. "You've done enough damage today." The banker shrugged and climbed back into his wagon. Soon only Clara and the Reverend remained, standing helplessly as Ethan stared. "Down the empty road, we'll appeal to the territorial governor," Reverend Blackwood promised. "This isn't over." But Ethan barely heard him. The sun was setting now, painting the hills in shades of fire and loss. Clara touched his arm gently before mounting her horse. "Come to services tomorrow," she pleaded. "Don't be alone with this." He nodded numbly, watching them ride away. The wind picked up, rustling through the cottonwood trees that lined his fence. Their leaves seemed to whisper Hope's name. Inside the house, evidence of their morning's happiness mocked him. The fresh bread sat cooling on the counter. Hope's slate lay on the table, covered in her careful drawings. Her empty chair waited by the fireplace, the blanket she loved still draped across it. Ethan moved through the motions of evening chores like a sleepwalker. He fed the stock, checked the water, closed up the barn. The house felt colder than he'd ever known it when he finally went inside. He couldn't bring himself to clear Hope's place at the table. The simple supper he managed to eat turned to ashes in his mouth as he stared at her empty chair. Each tick of the mantel clock seemed to echo the rhythm of horse hooves carrying her further away. "I'm sorry," he whispered into the silence. "Failed you, little one? I'm so sorry." Outside, the wind rose to a mournful howl, thrashing the cottonwoods. Their branches scraped against the house like fingers trying to claw their way in. But nothing could fill the void Hope's absence left behind. Ethan sat alone in the growing darkness, his head bowed under the weight of loss. On the table, Hope's slate still showed the careful marks she'd made that morning house, a horse, and two figures holding hands beneath a smiling sun. Dawn crept over the Colorado hills, painting the frost-covered grass in pale gold. Ethan Hale lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling. The familiar creaks of the old ranch house seemed harder to bear without Hope's quiet presence down the hall. Her empty room stood like an accusation. The rooster's crow finally drove him to his feet. He pulled on his work clothes mechanically, each movement feeling heavier than lead. The mirror showed him a face aged by grief, stubble rough on his jaw. He couldn't remember if he'd slept at all. Outside, the morning chores waited with merciless regularity. The cattle lowed hungrily in their pens, pressing against the fence rails. Ethan lifted hay bales into the feeders, his muscles working while his mind drifted. T kept catching glimpses of Hope's ghost, her small figure carrying eggs from the henhouse, her careful steps following his through the barn. The south pasture fence sagged where he'd meant to mend it yesterday. Before the posts needed resetting, wire needed stretching. But his tools felt wrong in his hands. Every task seemed to take twice as long without Hope's eager assistance. Even the animals sensed the difference. Penny, the pony, hung her head over the corral fence, watching the road as if waiting for her young rider to return. Evening found him slumped in his chair before the cold fireplace. The Bible lay unopened in his lap. He tried to form words of prayer, but they stuck in his throat like thorns. The silence pressed in, broken only by the tick of the mantel clock. A knock at the door startled him. Clara Dawson stood on his porch, her face determined in the fading light. Behind her, Reverend Blackwood's tall figure waited by their horses. Clara said softly. "We need to talk." He let them in, awkwardly, clearing Hope's slate and drawings from the table. Clara touched them gently before sitting down. "We've been gathering support," she explained. "People who saw Hope's true worth, who regret staying silent." Reverend Blackwood nodded. "Jake Miller's hands came to me yesterday. Said they remembered how the girls sensed that spring storm coming. Got their cattle to shelter before the worst hit. Saved half their calves. The Cooper boys too," Clara added. "They spoke of her warning them about the weak ice on the creek. And Mrs. Peterson hasn't forgotten how Hope helped her catch her runaway chickens." Ethan's throat tightened. "What good does it do now? She's gone." "No." Clara's hand covered his. "We fight, not with guns or fists, but with testimony. With the truth of who she is and what she means to this community. We're drafting petitions," the Reverend explained. "Gathering signatures from God-fearing folks willing to stand up for what's right. The territorial governor's a reasonable man. If enough respected citizens speak out, why would anyone risk their name for her?" Ethan's voice was bitter. "They stood by while she was taken, because some have conscience enough to regret their silence," Clara said firmly. "And others never wanted her gone, but feared speaking alone. You won't be alone this time," Reverend Blackwood promised. "The Lord moves in mysterious ways, son. Sometimes it takes a child to open hard hearts." Ethan stared at Hope's slate, her careful drawings still visible in the lamplight. A memory surfaced, her face shining with pride as she helped him mend fence, anticipating which tools he needed before he asked. "What do you need from me?" he asked finally. Clara smiled. "Your voice, your testimony as her father, and your willingness to keep fighting." They worked late into the night, writing out formal petitions by lamplight. The Reverend's careful hand recorded Ethan's halting words about Hope's character, her intelligence, her gift with animals. Clara added her own observations of Hope's quick learning and gentle influence on the other children. Over the next few days, more neighbors came forward. The widow Jenkins brought fresh bread and stories of Hope's kindness to her cats. Young Tom Wheeler, who worked at the livery, spoke of her extraordinary way with frightened horses. Even crusty old Sam Baker, who rarely left his cabin, rode in to sign his name. "Ain't right," he muttered, making his mark. "Taking a child from her home, my ma was Cherokee. Know something about that kind of wrong." Not everyone supported them. Griggs and his allies spread whispers about danger and disorder. Some doors closed in their faces, but others opened, offering coffee and signatures, small donations toward legal fees, quiet words of encouragement. One evening, after Clara and the Reverend had gone home, Ethan found himself alone with a growing stack of petitions. Hope's slate still sat on the table where he couldn't bear to move it. Her simple drawings showed what she had seen family home, belonging. For the first time since she was taken, Ethan knelt by his bed, his hands clasped tight, words finally breaking free. "Lord," he whispered, "keep her safe. Wherever she is tonight, let her know she's not forgotten, not unwanted. Let her feel your presence until," his voice cracked, "until we can bring her home." The wind whispered through the cottonwoods outside, carrying the first hint of rain. Somewhere far to the south, Ethan prayed. Hope was drawing pictures in the dust, watching the same stars, remembering love. He would not fail her again. Tomorrow would bring more work, more signatures, more small steps toward justice. But tonight, at last, he could pray. Not for himself, but for the daughter of his heart and the strength to win her back. Dawn painted the eastern sky in streaks of pink and gold as three riders set out from Ethan's ranch. Their horses' hooves kicked up dust from the dry trail as they headed toward the county seat. Ethan rode beside Miss Clara Dawson and Reverend Blackwood, the leather of their saddles creaking with each step. The morning air held an autumn chill that made their breath visible in white puffs. Clara had wrapped a thick shawl around her shoulders, while the Reverend's long coat flapped against his horse's flanks. They carried their precious petitions carefully stored in oilcloth to protect against dust and damp. "Judge Halbrook has a reputation for fairness," Reverend Blackwood said, breaking the morning silence. "He'll hear us out, even if he's not easily swayed." Ethan nodded, his jaw tight. The weight of what lay ahead pressed on him like a physical burden. Every hoofbeat carried him closer to the moment that would decide Hope's future and his own. They stopped briefly at midday to rest the horses and share a simple meal of bread and dried beef. Clara spread their documents on a flat rock, reviewing the signatures one last time. Her finger traced the careful rows of names. "So many people spoke up," she mused. "More than I expected." "The Lord moves hearts in His own time," the Reverend responded, brushing crumbs from his beard. The county courthouse rose before them late in the afternoon, its red brick walls catching the slanting sunlight. It stood 2 stories tall, with white-painted trim and a brass bell that gleamed above. The entrance? Several horses were already hitched outside, their riders conducting other business within. Inside, the air smelled of wood polish and old paper. Their bootsteps echoed on the wooden floors as they approached the clerk's desk. After a brief wait, they were shown into Judge Halbrook's chambers. The judge sat behind a massive oak desk, his silver hair and lined face speaking of decades of experience. wire-rimmed spectacles perched on his nose as he examined the papers they presented. The room was silent, except for the ticking of a tall clock in the corner. "So," Judge Halbrook said finally, looking up at Ethan. "You wish to adopt this Apache?" Girl, a deaf child, no less. His tone was neutral, probing. "Tell me, Mr. Hale, why would a struggling rancher take on such a burden?" Ethan stood straighter, meeting the judge's gaze. "Because she is not a burden, Your Honor, she is my daughter." His voice carried the quiet conviction of truth. Maybe. Not by blood, but by every other measure that matters. Clara stepped forward, laying out samples of Hope's schoolwork on the desk. "She's quick to learn, Your Honor. These drawings show how she understands relationships between things. She's created her own way of communicating through pictures and signs." The judge examined the careful chalk marks, the simple but expressive drawings. His eyebrows lifted slightly. "And she's got gifts that help the whole community," Ethan continued. "She can sense storms coming before anyone else notices. Saved half a dozen calves last month by warning us to move them to shelter." Two ranch hands who had ridden separately to the courthouse stepped forward to confirm this. They described how Hope had insisted on moving the herd, tugging at sleeves and pointing at the sky. Hours before the storm broke, Reverend Blackwood cleared his throat. "If I may, Your Honor?" He opened his Bible to a marked passage. "Scripture tells us pure religion is this, to look after orphans and widows in their distress." Mr. Hale has done exactly what our Lord commands, taken in a child others cast aside. Judge Halbrook listened, his expression thoughtful but reserved. He studied the petitions, noting the number of respected names. His fingers drummed slowly on his desk. "The law has certain requirements," he said finally. "And there's the matter of the Army's claim." "Under current treaties," yelled up a hand as Ethan started to protest. "However, I will hear all sides before making my decision. I'll summon the sergeant to present his case." "The girl is being held at the Army post?" the judge asked. "Yes, Your Honor," Clara answered. "Less than 20 miles from here." "Very well." Judge Halbrook made a note in his ledger. "I'll have my clerk send for Sergeant Miller immediately. Return tomorrow at 10 o'clock. We'll settle this matter properly." They rode back as sunset painted the western sky in deep oranges and purples. The trip seemed longer, with uncertainty weighing on their minds. Clara and the Reverend spoke quietly, discussing what else they might say tomorrow. But Ethan remained silent, lost in thought. Night had fallen by the time they reached his ranch. Clara touched his arm before riding on toward town. "Have faith, Ethan. We've done all we can. The Lord hears a father's prayers," Reverend Blackwood added, even ones spoken in silence. Ethan nodded his thanks, too tired for words. He took care of his horse mechanically, then trudged into the dark house. The emptiness seemed to mock him. Hope's slate still lay on the table where he couldn't bear to move it. He built up the fire, more for company than warmth. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls as he sat in his chair. Remembering Hope's silent laughter, her quick mind, her gentle way with animals. Somewhere at the Army post, she was alone, probably frightened, maybe thinking he had abandoned her like all the others. "Hold on, little one," he whispered to the fire. "Just hold on." The clock ticked away the hours as Ethan kept his vigil, unable to sleep. Tomorrow would bring judgment. Tomorrow would decide if his daughter came home more, if his house would remain forever silent. All he could do now was wait and pray and remember the look in Hope's eyes when she first signed the word Father. Outside, a coyote called to its mate, a lonely sound that echoed across the empty pastures. Ethan stared into the flames, his heart aching with both hope and fear. As the long night slowly passed, the courthouse steps gleamed with morning dew. As people began gathering in the pale light of dawn, Ethan stood quietly with Miss Clara Dawson and Reverend Blackwood, watching wagons and riders arrive from town. His hands were steady, but his heart raced beneath his Sunday vest. The courthouse. Bell tolled 10 times, its deep notes rolling across the square. Judge Halbrook's clerk opened the heavy wooden doors, ushering everyone inside. The courtroom filled quickly with the shuffle of boots and rustle of skirts. Wooden benches creaked under the weight of concerned citizens. Sergeant Miller sat rigidly. At a table near the front, his blue uniform pristine, his papers arranged with military precision. He kept his eyes forward as Ethan and his supporters took their places at the opposing table. The morning sun streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Judge Halbrook entered, his black robes sweeping behind him. Everyone rose, then settled back as he took his seat behind the elevated desk. He adjusted his spectacles, surveying the crowded room. "We are here," he began, his voice carrying to the back walls to determine the rightful placement of the child known as Hope, formerly Naline, daughter of a Chiricahua Apache scout. He nodded to Sergeant Miller. "The Army may present its position." Miller stood, his posture parade ground perfect. "Your Honor, federal regulations are clear. Children of reservation status must be placed in authorized facilities. We have an orphanage in New Mexico specifically equipped for such cases." He lifted a document. "These orders come directly from the Department of War and the child's father." The judge asked. "Killed in service, Your Honor, as an Army scout." Miller's voice held no emotion, which places her more firmly under military jurisdiction. "I see." Judge Halbrook made a note. "Mr. Hale, you may speak." Ethan rose slowly, his calloused hands resting on the table's edge. "Your Honor, Hope came to me half dead, tied to my fence, like unwanted cattle." His quiet words carried pain and purpose. "In these past weeks, she has shown more courage and wisdom than many grown folks I know." One by one, townsfolk stood to testify. The livery stable owner described how Hope had calmed a spooked horse that might have trampled a child. A rancher's wife told of Hope's gift for sensing weather changes, saving livestock from sudden storms. Each story built upon the last, painting a picture of a child who brought value, not burden, to their community. Reverend Blackwood stepped forward, his Bible open in his weathered hands. "Scripture teaches us, Your Honor, that true religion is caring for orphans in their distress." His deep voice resonated with conviction. "Mr. Hale has done exactly that, taking in one whom others cast aside." Miss Dawson rose next, her normally gentle voice firm with purpose. "Hope is learning to sign, Your Honor. She has created her own ways to communicate through drawings and gestures." She placed Hope's slate work on the judge's desk. "She is a child of promise, not of pity. She needs love and stability, not institutional care." "And what of her heritage?" Judge Halbrook asked, studying the drawings. "Her Apache blood." The question hung heavy in the air. Ethan straightened, meeting the judge's gaze. "Her father died serving this country, Your Honor. He wore the Army's blue, scouted their trails, gave his life for their cause." His voice grew stronger. "Oh, she deserves more than abandonment. She deserves a home." A profound silence fell over the courtroom. Even Sergeant Miller shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The truth of Ethan's words seemed to settle like dust after a storm, impossible to brush away. Judge Halbrook removed his spectacles, polishing them slowly with a white handkerchief. "This requires careful consideration," he said, finally. "I will deliver my verdict at sunset." He struck his gavel once. "This court is adjourned." People filed out slowly, talking in hushed voices. Ethan stood motionless until Clara touched his arm gently. "Come," she said. "We have done all we can." The hours crawled by like wounded things. Ethan walked the streets of the county seat, too restless to sit still. He passed the telegraph office, the general store, the small church on the corner. Each step was a prayer without words. As the sun began its descent, townsfolk gathered again. At the courthouse, they came not just from the county seat, but from the surrounding ranches and farms. Even those who had once whispered against hope now stood quietly. Waiting for judgment, Ethan found himself kneeling in the small church across the square. Afternoon light filtered through colored glass, painting the rough wooden floor in rainbow hues. His lips moved in silent prayer. "Lord," he whispered, "she is yours before she is mine." The courthouse bell began to toll, calling them all to hear the verdict. Ethan rose, straightened his vest, and walked out into the golden light of sunset. Whatever came next, he would face it standing tall, supported by the community that had learned to see hope through his eyes. The crowd parted silently, making way for him to climb the courthouse steps one more time. Each footfall echoed with the weight of the moment, carrying him toward whatever justice the fading day would bring. The setting sun painted the courthouse windows in amber and gold as people filed back inside. Judge Halbrook's clerk lit the oil lamps, their gentle glow casting warm circles in the growing dusk. The wooden benches creaked under the weight of what seemed like half the county. All gathered to hear the verdict. Ethan's hands trembled slightly as he stood beside Miss Dawson. Reverend Blackwood placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. Across the aisle, Sergeant Miller maintained his rigid posture, though his fingers drummed once against his sword belt before going still. The door to the judge's chambers opened. Judge Halbrook emerged, his black robes seeming to absorb the lamplight. The room rose in unison, then settled at his gesture. He adjusted his spectacles and lifted a single sheet of paper. In the matter of guardianship concerning the child known as Hope. "Formerly Naline," he began, his voice clear and measured, "I have weighed federal regulation against moral obligation. I have considered military jurisdiction against community. Testimony." He paused, looking over his glasses at the assembled crowd. "The law is clear regarding children of reservation status," he continued. "However, the law must also serve justice. This child's father died in service to our nation, wearing an Army Scout's badge. To now condemn his daughter to an orphanage, hundreds of miles from those who have shown her care," he shook his head slowly. "That would be a poor reward for his sacrifice." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Sergeant Miller half rose from his chair, but the judge held up his hand. "Furthermore, Mr. Hale and this community have demonstrated not just willingness, but genuine ability to provide for this child's unique needs. They have shown understanding of her gifts, patience with her challenges, and respect for her heritage." Judge Halbrook set down his paper and removed his spectacles. "Therefore, I find that while federal orders regarding reservation placement are clear, they are, in this instance, unjust. This court hereby grants legal guardianship of Hope to Ethan Hale, with all rights and responsibilities thereof." Gasps filled the room, followed by scattered applause. Sergeant Miller shot to his feet. "Your Honor, I must protest. The regulations are guidelines." Sergeant Judge Halbrook cut in firmly, "not chains. Justice is not always found in regulations, but in wisdom and mercy. My ruling stands." The sergeant's face flushed red, but he snapped his mouth shut and sat down hard in his chair. At the back of the courtroom, Banker Griggs stood abruptly, his face twisted in anger. He stormed toward the door, shoving past several people in his haste to leave, but Ethan barely noticed. His knees had gone weak with relief, and he gripped the table to steady himself. Miss Dawson was crying softly beside him, while Reverend Blackwood's amen rumbled like distant thunder. "Court is adjourned," Judge Halbrook declared, striking his gavel once. The room erupted in celebration. Ranchers clapped Ethan on the back. Their wives wiped tears from their eyes, and children danced in the aisles. But Ethan had only one thought now. "The army post," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I need to get to Hope. My buggy's outside." Miss Dawson said quickly, "I'll drive you." They hurried through the deepening twilight, the wheels of Miss Dawson's buggy raising dust as they raced toward the army post on the edge of town. The guard at the gate, having heard the news, waved them through without challenge. In the post's temporary holding area, Hope sat alone on a narrow cot, her small frame rigid with tension. She had been there 3 days, watching the door like a hawk. When Ethan appeared in the doorway, her entire being transformed. Her face lit up like sunrise, and she launched herself across the room. Ethan caught her in his arms, lifting her high off the ground. Hope's silent tears wet his shirt as she clung to him. He set her down gently, cupping her face in his calloused hands. Speaking slowly so she could read his lips, he said, "You are home now." More tears spilled down his weathered cheeks, but he was smiling so hard his face hurt. Hope's fingers traced his tears, then formed the sign for father that Miss Dawson had taught her. Ethan nodded, pulling her close again. People began gathering outside the post ranchers and their families. Shopkeepers, farmhands, and even a few soldiers who had grown fond of the quiet girl during her stay. Miss Dawson stood with Reverend Blackwood, both beaming through their tears. Hope looked around at all the familiar faces. Then, up at Ethan. Her hands moved carefully, forming the signs they had practiced so many times. Family and home. "That's right, little one," Ethan whispered, though she couldn't hear him. "We're going home." The crowd parted as Ethan carried Hope to Miss Dawson's buggy. The setting sun had painted the western sky in brilliant strokes of purple and gold, as if heaven itself was celebrating. As they drove toward town, friendly hands reached up to touch Hope's shoulder or pat Ethan's back. The community that had once whispered in suspicion now surrounded them with support and joy. Hope nestled against Ethan's side in the buggy, her fingers curled tightly in his coat. Her other hand shaped one word over and over in the growing darkness: Father. The ranch buzzed with new life as spring melted into summer. Morning light spilled across the corral where Ethan stood beside Hope's dappled pony, showing her how to hold the reins just so. Her small hands mimicked his gestures perfectly, and her face glowed with pride as she guided the gentle creature in careful circles. "That's it," Ethan said, though she couldn't hear him. He signed the words they had practiced. "Good riding." Hope beamed at his praise, sitting straighter in her saddle. The pony, sensing her confidence, picked up its pace with a happy trot. Along the north fence where Ethan had found her that frost-covered morning, Hope had planted rows of sunflower seeds. Already, green shoots pushed through the dark soil, reaching for the sky. She checked them each morning, marking their progress in a little notebook Miss Dawson had given her. What had once been a place of sorrow was transforming into a garden of hope. Twice a week, Miss Dawson rode out to the ranch, bringing books and patience. She sat with Hope at the kitchen table, teaching her letters and new signs. Hope soaked up knowledge like the parched earth soaked up rain, her quick mind matching her eager hands. One Sunday, Reverend Blackwood came to bless their home. Neighbors gathered in the yard, bringing gifts: quilting fabric from the miller's wife, vegetable seeds from the garden store, books for Hope from families in town. The same people who had once whispered in fear now crowded around their table. Sharing coffee and cake, Ethan threw himself into ranch work with renewed vigor. The barn roof that had leaked for 2 seasons was finally patched properly. He cleared new fields for planting, repaired the chicken coop, and added a fresh coat of whitewash to the house. The land seemed to respond to his care, as if it, too, felt the surge of new life. At supper, Hope helped set the table, carefully placing his wife's old china just so. When they sat down to eat, she signed family with excited fingers, grinning from ear to ear. The simple gesture broke something loose in Ethan's chest. And suddenly he was laughing deep, genuine laughter that he hadn't felt in years. That night, after Hope was tucked into bed, Ethan stood on the porch under a canopy of stars. His prayer was simple but profound. "Thank you, Lord. I thought you sent her here for me to save, but you sent her to save me too." The autumn wind carried the scent of dried grass across the Colorado range. 3 months had passed since the judge's ruling. And though droughts still threatened and debts lingered, Ethan's ranch showed signs of new life everywhere he looked. Hope rode beside him on her dappled pony, her back straight and proud as they checked the fence lines together. She had grown stronger, more confident, their silent language of gestures now as natural as breathing. Her eyes constantly scanned the horizon, reading the land in ways Ethan was still learning to understand. Suddenly, Hope tugged her reins and pointed urgently at the gathering clouds. Her hands moved quickly, signing storm and hurry. Ethan had learned to trust these warnings. She could sense changes in the air pressure that even the cattle missed. Together, they raced to gather the herd, driving them toward shelter just. As the sky split open, they arrived home soaked to the bone, but Hope's silent laughter was infectious. Miss Clara Dawson waited on the porch, concern melting into relief at their return. She had been spending more evenings at the ranch lately, her presence warming the house in ways that made Ethan's heart skip. Over bowls of steaming stew, Clara taught them both new signs, her gentle patience matching Hope's eager learning. The kitchen, once so empty, now rang with the sounds of plates and quiet joy. After supper, Hope disappeared into her room, returning with something clutched behind her back. She presented Ethan with a small wooden carving rough hewn but made. With obvious care, a cross with the word home scratched beneath it in careful letters. Ethan's throat tightened as he pulled her close, feeling her small arms wrap around his neck at dusk. Ethan walked to the north fence where he had found her that frost-covered morning. Tall sunflowers nodded in the evening breeze, their bright faces following the setting sun. What had once been a place of abandonment now bloomed with life and color. Quick footsteps approached, and Hope appeared at his side. Her hands moved with certainty, family, forever. Ethan nodded, his heart full and steady. Together, they turned toward the ranch house, its windows glowing with warm lamplight. Each step carried them toward home, toward the promise of tomorrow, toward the family they had built from faith and love. Thanks for taking a moment to feel with me. If this story reminded you of what matters, hit subscribe. I'll be here tomorrow, continuing our story.